Raymond Scott is a senior associate in the commercial team at Simpson Grierson. He's with me now to talk about the EU FTA legislation amendment bill and how it seems to overwhelmingly favour the EU side of the EU and New Zealand equation. Ray, thank you for coming in. Now, tell us about the bill, first of all.
Sure. So preceding this was the entering into the free trade agreement between New Zealand and EU. And as part of that, New Zealand needs to introduce local legislation to bring that into effect. This bill that now has been introduced will implement part of those obligations from a local perspective, and a core part of that relates to geographical indications. Now, New Zealand has an existing geographical indication registration regime. What a geographical indication does is it signals that a particular product comes from a particular geographic region and is associated with certain characteristics or qualities of that product. Classic examples are Scotch whisky and champagne, which are existing registered GIs in New Zealand. Now, as part of this bill, it's going to make quite significant changes to our existing regime, and as part of that will allow for the registration of almost 2,000 EU GIs in New Zealand for a very wide range of goods. Meanwhile, New Zealanders won't have equivalent rights granted to the EU through that process. So it does seem lopsided in the way that the bill has introduced that.
Weren't EU geographical indications already recognised in New Zealand before this?
Yeah, so there is a process for EU territories to be able to register GIs in New Zealand, and that's limited to just wines and spirits, as is the case of any New Zealander or any other territory to register just GIs for wines and spirits. So again, mentioning, you've got champagne, you've got Scotch whisky as existing EU GIs in New Zealand. You've got, for example, Napa Valley from the US, and then you've got a whole tranche of New Zealand-related GIs registered here. You've got certain ones such as North Island, South Island, Waiheke, Central Otago, Marlborough, the ones you'd expect that really focus on our wine-producing regions.
Right. So let's talk a bit more about how lopsided this bill as proposed is. What will it mean for New Zealanders who want to set up these geographical indicators and sell into the EU?
It's really about, what can they do within New Zealand? I think that's really the big impact here. And it's twofold. One is, with all these EU GIs that are going to be registered in New Zealand, it means that New Zealand producers will need to look at transitioning out and stop using certain terms. So for example, we've got feta, Prosecco, Parma ham. Those are some of the examples of the type of EU GIs which are going to come into play in New Zealand. And there's certain transitional provisions around that, but it means that if you're, say, a new producer in New Zealand that wants to introduce a new feta product, you're not going to be able to use the term feta, or at least certainly not after that transition. And the other aspect is, what if you're a New Zealand producer who wants to register a GI for something other than wines and spirits? Say New Zealand, a bluff oyster industry wants to register a GI for bluff oysters in New Zealand. Yeah. They wouldn't be able to do that here.
Okay. Why should the honey industry be disappointed?
Well, Manuka's been a key term, which is certainly which the New Zealand industry has been seeking to protect. And currently, as it stands, it's not possible to register Manuka or Manuka honey as a GI in New Zealand. There was an attempt to register it as a certification mark in New Zealand that failed as well. So again, there's this lopsided view on protecting certain EU terms or certain industries, but lacking the ability for, say, honey producers to protect terms in New Zealand. I do have to mention, though, under the FTA, there are some provisions at least that provide recognition for the trade in Manuka honey. So it's quite possible that you'll see benefits in the export of Manuka honey to EU and the overall net benefit that goes along with the fair a free trade agreement deal.
2,000 is a lot, isn't it?
Yes, and compared to what is the 23 New Zealand GIs, which will be able to get protection in the EU through their process. So again, that's in part the consequence of New Zealand being a smaller market and with less of a history perhaps as the EU, but also a consequence of New Zealand's GI regime only being for wines and spirits, and therefore our existing scope is much narrower.
Can the EU add to these 2,000?
Yes, so there is a process for the EU to add to that list or change the list. That has to go through the Trade Committee. So the Trade Committee has representatives from both the EU and New Zealand. So who knows what's going to come out of that. And any changes to that do have to go through an examination and opposition procedure. But again, it's quite remarkable that the FTA envisages that those 2,000 odd should go through that procedure as well, but the bill just doesn't allow it.
Why has it developed in such a lopsided way, do you think?
It's very curious, and it's very difficult to really answer that. One possible factor that's gone into it is that New Zealand has also entered into a free trade agreement with the UK. And if New Zealand makes certain substantive changes to its geographical indication regime, it will trigger a requirement for New Zealand then to engage with the UK about changes with that. But even then, it doesn't answer the question of why not just open up the geographical indication regime in New Zealand to allow producers to register them for other products such as cheeses or honey or any other produce other than just wines and spirits.
And do we have any indication of why our governments, successive governments perhaps, have been reluctant to open that up?
No, well, I'm not aware of anything. And, whether this is also a case of the FTA coming into force about halfway through this year, it's anticipated that it will be, and the need to really rush to get legislation in line to implement that. But then, so be it, if you need to rush to get the legislation done, but surely it would be more efficient then, if this was on their horizon, to actually just make the changes at the same time to allow New Zealand producers to have that same broad scope of rights as well.
I haven't heard a huge outcry from producers. Why is that, do you think?
Again, I think there were some checks and balances under the FTA. What I would be interested to see now is how this bill progresses. And now that we've seen the wording of the bill, and as it goes through select committee and the readings through the legislative process, whether we do see more industry bodies speaking out about this, because now's the opportunity to do that, while we've still got this as proposed legislation before it's enacted.
To support our award-winning independent journalism, subscribe to nbr.co.nz.